Hello. He's an emerging country. He's a third world podcaster.
Well, thank you very much. What an introduction that is. Good evening, Graham. Good evening, Anthony.
Hello, Charles.
Hello. So, Graham, we're recording on a Wednesday, a different night of the week. Why not? 7 nights to choose from, not always a Sunday, and not every day is like Sunday. So this is Wednesday.
Yeah, well, I like to think what we say and do is timeless.
Timeless is not a word I've ever considered it, but I'm sure it's for the gods, Graham. It's for the gods what we say, you know.
The gods, the gods, the gods.
The gods, the gods, the gods, which is that show is coming around on the circuit. Alex Wright's show that's back in action.
It's at Harrogate Theatre this Friday.
Yeah, now, but Alex is still in New York directing The Great Gatsby, so it must be he must have got a different casting for it.
Well, there must be at least some different cast members for sure. Yeah.
So I don't know who's in it. I've been trying to find out actually, but anyway.
Yeah.
So sorry to be vague on that, but I was told that Alex is still in New York, so clearly
it is very good, doesn't it? It's great production.
We loved it in Edinburgh, didn't we? Now, Graham, talking of things that we're not quite sure of, Paul Simon's new album, or is it an album? It's 7 movements, and it's a composition apparently that, quote, transcends the concept of the album, which always makes me nervous as to what that means. Is it an extended EP? Is it an album? It's definitely called 7 Psalms. He's definitely 81 years old. And somewhat surprisingly, you want to look at it in the context of Paul Simon versus Ed Sheeran and versus what Paul Simon used to be. A sort of cryptic message as a starting point. So I really think this is an open territory for you to explore.
Well, I genuinely think Ed Sheeran's Subtract album has better songs than 7 Psalms. Also, in a less annoying way, you can actually play individual tracks on the Ed Sheeran album. Whereas in 7 Psalms, which lasts about 31 minutes, I kept on trying to move forward to the second track and the third track, and it wouldn't do it. And I assumed that my CD player was playing up, but in fact, you can't do it.
Even Paul Simon was playing up.
Yes, Paul Simon was playing up. Even though it's 7 tracks, it's sequenced as 1 track, so you can't flick. You have to listen to the whole thing, or you have to switch it off. One of the two. And
so you switched it off.
Well, no, I've played the whole thing a few times. It's a sort of song suite where there's basically only one song. The individual tunes aren't that different from the first one called The Lord. And they all seem to feature the same sort of sound, same riff, same tempo, same everything, really. The lyrics change, although the lyrics also share themes as well. So in one way, it's a really ambitious work. You know, he's trying to achieve something grand and something deeply spiritual that isn't just pop music, but he's forgotten
Has
about
he
one.
Succeeded?
Only in the sense of the atmosphere. It's a great atmosphere, apart from acoustic guitar, where you get Paul Simon's beautiful guitar playing, which he does show every now and again and has done for an awful long time. But until recent years, he didn't really trade on his acoustic guitar playing.
No.
And after So Beautiful, So What, he started to sort of like focus more on his guitar playing, and the acoustic guitar playing sounds fantastic, warm and rhythmical and a bit complex. And there's bits of like sort of Arabic and Indian bells and instruments, a little bit of harmonium. So it's a good sound. It's full of atmosphere, and it feels like you could play it in a church. It does sound spiritual, but it hasn't actually got any great tunes. Full stop. And in that way, it's worse than Ed Sheeran. It's also worse than, almost every other album he's done, because Bridge Over Troubled Water was spiritual, but had a fantastic tune. And he's done many songs with a spiritual aspect with great tunes.
Yes.
And his old age, he seems to have gone away from tunes. I mean, Stranger, which got rave reviews, again traded on its sound and only had about 3 properly good tunes. And even So Beautiful, So What wasn't packed with great songs. It was So he seems to have drifted towards the feel over actually writing songs. And since Paul Simon is one of the world's greatest ever songwriters, I think it's a bit of a shame.
It's interesting tactic, this one where you can't move it on, having decided that actually this bit's not very interesting, I want to play the next bit. What if other artists took that attitude and didn't facilitate moving things on? I mean, I often get annoyed when people decide to give up on playing an album properly and in album order, and the modern way of listening to a bit here and there. This obviously is taking that further to the extent that you really have to listen properly, or you just switch it off. And so if the listener has to work that little bit harder, in the great tradition of listening to BBC Radio 3, anything wrong with that?
Well, in one sense, it is worth the 31-minute journey because the lyrics are very good and the atmosphere is great. But once you listen to it, if you take the time to steep your head in it and just sit back and relax and concentrate, you don't find yourself remembering it later in the day. You don't find any of the musical moments sticking in your brain. And at the end of the day, music, especially recorded music, is supposed to be something memorable. Otherwise, why record it? I mean, to my mind, it's so ethereal and so abstract. It sort of makes Van Morrison's Astral Week sound like steps.
And so you're not even having it as, I mean, it's an even more of a minus than Subtract for Ed Sheeran.
Well, I think if you saw him play it in a gorgeous church, you'd be totally knocked out. And it's a great artistic achievement, but it's not massively pleasurable to listen to.
How, Graham, does it compare with Bob Dylan's 17-minute Meisterwerk that was given to us not that long ago on Stones of Tablet and has been...
Murder Most Foul was about, I think it was about 24 minutes, wasn't it? I can't remember now.
Yeah, it was the subject of a 3-hour program on BBC Six Music, looking at all the references and the music actually that was referred to in the songs. That how does it? I mean, maybe it's a lazy comparison to make, but the lyrics within that song by Bob Dylan were fascinating still, and yet there wasn't. We're not talking a memorable tune there, but the way he used the words within the structure still made it compelling listening. Does that differ with Paul Simon? Is it not in any way compelling listening?
Murder Most Foul is a great track on it's the second CD in Rough and Rowdy Ways, which came out in 2020 during the first lockdown. It's a brilliant track because it's entertaining and it's got a sort of tune that you enjoy listening to, and it's got a warm feel that you enjoy listening to. So it's easy on the ear, and all the references to changing pop and political culture from the 60s onwards, 50s onwards. It keeps your mind going the whole time because it sparks little thoughts every 3 or 4 seconds and then adds up to a gigantic tapestry of how America and politics and culture have changed in the last 50 years. So it's not a particularly, it's only a personal song in the sense that Dylan takes politics and culture and music really seriously. So it feels personal, but it's really a cultural song. Whereas Paul Simon's song's really about aging. Although it's a very spiritual album, Seven Psalms, it isn't strictly speaking a religious album. It's more a spiritual album. It's all about his aging and things changing.
He's 81 now.
The meaning of life and him as a songwriter. But it's not really about religion. It's certainly not about organized religion, hardly at all.
So this is his seventh Age of Man album, then.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I mean, we wouldn't be discussing if it wasn't. But
do we think it's his valedictory album? Do we foresee that this is perhaps his final statement?
Well, he keeps on doing albums that critics think are going to be his final album, and they turn out not to be. So who knows?
Well,
but I would say
Willie Nelson is still going strong. So he's got some way to go to match Willie.
I would not swap Stranger to Stranger album or In the Blue Light or Seven Psalms for Graceland or Still Crazy After All These Years.
No.
Or Bridge Over Troubled Water or Bookends. None of them, because the songs aren't as good, but they are interesting albums with some good songs.
I mean, you could argue that towards the end of Bowie's songwriting. They were not as melodious. The songwriting craft and stretched him in different ways, but nevertheless they were still fascinating because they were breaking new territory for him. And then, of course, in the case of the last album, a day later he was gone from our world. And I wonder whether that is there's almost an inevitable decline in melody for songwriters. It's long been talked of. You could use Elvis Costello as another example, where different gifts come through in the songwriting, but the basic level of gifted melody writing, it didn't apply to the Rolling Stones, invariably goes down. There is maybe an exception, and McCartney still is remarkably melodious in his songwriting.
That's true. That is true. The thing about McCartney is that by McCartney's standards, Egypt Station and McCartney 3 aren't classic albums. But compared to the standard of pop songwriting now, they still sound really good.
Exactly.
You got to admire Paul Simon for pushing himself. He hasn't settled on an easy artistic life. No. But it doesn't mean to say I have to love the results.
No, absolutely. So, Graham, I went to see a documentary at City Screen York, City Screen Picturehouse, made by Lisa Cortes about Little Richard, called I Am Everything, or to give it its full title, Little Richard, I Am Everything. And what this film is looking at, and actually there's also been a BBC documentary on Little Richard as well, is whether he has not had the credit that he should have had as, if you like, the originator of rock and roll. This is something that he himself, Little Richard, became obsessed with, that instead it tended to be that Elvis Presley was seen as the leading light, or he would see the Rolling Stones, who would even in some ways copy his energy on stage, would do his songs. He would see the Beatles singing his songs. And Little Richard, it wasn't until late in life that he finally received the accolade that he believes he deserved, of which he then made a very strong point about it. And in his later days interviews, he would always be making that point that he hadn't been given the credit that he deserved. And this film looks at how it made him feel. And yet, of course, he was a complex man as well because of his sexual orientation. And then because he then decided that he would focus on his spiritual side, his spiritual dimension, he said, we should be about Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve, a memorable line that he used in distancing himself from his own homosexuality, which was discomforting for those who saw him as a crusader, if you like, with his sheer vivacity and very open sexuality initially.
To use a Little Richard phrase, he flip-flopped on everything, didn't he? He was for the Lord expertise for sexual.
One of his very early lyrics was a lyric about anal sex, as he delighted in pointing out in an interview in subsequent years.
Well, even the words rock and roll is a euphemism for sex.
Yes,
but the thing about rock and roll, which allowed it to be palatable, is that rock and roll actually is also from the Bible. So even though it's a euphemism for sex, it's got strong gospel and biblical connotations, which to a white audience, which is what rock and roll was pitched to, was a white audience. Rock and roll would have been more palatable than what Little Richard would have originally said.
Well, he would see these very polite versions of his songs being done on now, obviously in grainy black and white films, of forgettable acts that had hits with songs that he thinks forever should be associated with him. I do think in many ways that probably this is a wrong that is gradually being righted, and our appreciation of any number of talents, which is how the film closes. It reminds us of James Brown having clearly taken influence from Little Richard. Obviously, we've mentioned Beatles, we've mentioned Rolling Stones doing that. Prince clearly again took that, and even suggests that a musician like Harry Styles is in some ways influenced by Little Richard, which might be pushing it a little bit far, but it sees the link between the showman of today, who's transcended being British and been successful in America as well. Where do you stand on Little Richard, Graham? Do you think he is undervalued?
I think, yeah, he's undervalued, but there's at least four kings of rock and roll: Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little
Yeah.
Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis,
Mm.
and they would all argue their own corner, and they all had huge egos.
Yeah.
And to be honest, none of them came first. They were all doing things about the same time. And the first one who broke big was Elvis.
Was Elvis?
He was mainstream before the other ones, but they also broke big not very far after Elvis, and they also influenced Elvis as well. So Elvis was like an amalgam of all the great R&B and gospel and country music at the time.
Yes.
Whereas they were more purely rock and roll in some ways than Elvis. But
Yeah.
if you think about Elvis, Elvis brought a bit of sex to rock and roll and a lot of glamour.
Yes.
Chuck Berry brought the brains, because Chuck Berry's lyrics were the most intelligent rock and roll lyrics. Buddy Holly brought the pop and the sort of everyman quality.
And Jerry, what did he bring?
Eddie Cochran brought the cool. Well, Jerry Lee Lewis brought a bit of wildness, but he brought wildness in a sort of like unpalatable, debauched redneck way.
Yeah.
And what Little Richard did was he brought the wildness, but with a coolness as well and a style that made it look like you want to be Little Richard. I mean, who would want to be Jerry Lee Lewis? I mean, he came across like an absolute madman, but you would have wanted to be Little Richard. He looked pretty cool, you know, banging the keyboards with his pompadour hairstyle and his open suits. You know, he was like, in some ways, he was the coolest looking rock and roller, obviously apart from Elvis. He was gorgeous looking, and Paul McCartney loved Little Richard as much as he loved Elvis. So I think he is really important.
I mean, it's the lyrics as well, which may be underrated, but one of the great traditions of rock and roll is to make up phrases that make no sense, seemingly outwardly. A tradition that continued, obviously, with T-Rex and even to some extent with the song titles of Slade. So again, there was an influence there in what Little Richard sang. I think what struck me most at the height of Little Richard's performing skills was the level of energy. I don't think anything's matched it on stage. Extraordinary energy in performance. The sweat coming off that man in performance, and the electricity. It was one of those you felt that if you touched him, the spark would come off you in some way. Oh, and Jimi Hendrix was seen as being influenced by him as well. Another one to mention. So I think this film, and maybe it isn't righting or wrong. I think you make a really astute point. Actually, you know, there are plenty of forefathers of rock and roll, but I would like to think that perhaps the appreciation of Little Richard will grow, and that
also can remember
help to do that.
You got to remember that he wasn't totally overlooked. I mean, I remember buying a book that came out in 1984 called The Life and Times of Little Richard by Charles White.
Yes,
and that was like a revelation because it told his whole life story, and as well as the music and the high points, you also got all these like flip-flopping between sexuality and religion, and you also got some hideous stories about when he was on tour in the 50s. And this is not something I usually repeat in polite company. He used to spend an awful lot of time on tour masturbating, which must have been really annoying for the rest of the band.
Not a detail. Charles White, of course, is the venerable Dr. Rock of BBC Radio York fame, who wrote wonderful rock and roll books, as well as being a brilliant rock and roll DJ. The Irishman, Dr. Rock. So good to have mentioned him in that, Graham. So that was my interest in Little Richard for this week. Now, if we go back to Magna Carta, we probably aren't talking the Magna Carta that goes back a very, very long way.
Well, not quite that old.
Not quite that old. I'm beginning to feel ancient these days. But Magna Carta and the new Guy Ritchie film about swinging 60s London that never happened. Now, that as a sentence I want to slightly deconstruct. Is there a link between Magna Carta and the new Guy Ritchie film? Is the Guy Ritchie film about swinging 60s London that never happened? Is it a swinging London that never happened? Or is it that the films never happened with Guy Ritchie?
I'll explain it. As you know, Magna Carta, led by the brilliant songwriter Chris Simpson, who was born in Harrogate.
Whose biography you are currently writing?
Well, only on the 4th year of it. I mean, at this rate, I'm nearly as bad as Matt Lewis, who's trying to do volume 2 of his Beatles series. But Yeah, I mean, they made it big in the early 70s with Magna
Yeah.
Carta, deservedly so, but not really big. They never really had
No.
any true hits.
No.
Their albums were always slow burners that sold a lot over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And by the 80s, as a commercial proposition in Britain, I mean, they were still successful in Spain and Germany and Scandinavia, but they were dead in the water by the 80s in Britain. And they've
Yeah.
never really got back from that situation. But then they never really go away. So, for example, there's a great new 3 CD and 1 DVD box set out called When All Is Said and Done, which tracks their whole career. And when you listen to it, it hasn't even got all their best tracks. But when you listen to it, the breadth and range of different song styles that Chris Simpson and Magna Carta have done over the last 50 years and the quality of the songwriting is absolutely amazing. It's just, they should be a much more famous band. And Chris Simpson should be a much more famous musician.
Yeah.
But they never die. The fact that they keep on having these compilations over and over again over the years in Britain shows that they can't. They're like a a vampire that can't be nailed down. And Chris, who I last saw a couple of months ago, was
Yeah.
talking about how he's always got links to publishers. He's still got contacts within music industry,
Yeah.
and every now and again, someone pops up who loves Magna Carta songs, who's got some clout. So this guy in the music business said, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get your songs in this new film called Chelsea Cowboy. And I said, what's that? And Chris said, well, it was going to be a film set in swinging 60s London. You know, slightly like a drugstore cowboy.
Yeah.
With a little bit of drugs and stuff. And they were going to use 3 Magna Carta songs in the soundtrack, which obviously would have been great for Magna Carta's career.
Yeah.
But sadly, the film never happened. Even with Guy Ritchie's clout, it didn't quite come off. So no such film has been started yet. Although you never know in the film industry. I mean, someone might pick the script up and then make it a couple of years' time. You never know.
Yeah.
But the fact that it even got to the stage where they were going to use 3 Magna Carta tracks on a Guy Ritchie film, despite the fact that Magna Carta are not famous at all now in Britain, is pretty amazing.
So that's one of those could have been, would have been, should have been scenarios.
There's a lot of those in the Magna Carta
story. But the definitely there is the new compilation, you say. So Graham, which label is that on, and do we know who's actually put it together? Whether Chris was overseeing this compilation, or whether it's someone who's decided as a Magna Carta nut to go ahead and put together a compilation?
Well, it's on Repertoire Records, and Chris was involved. And I don't know what it is, but despite the fact they haven't had any hits in Britain really at all, and they haven't done a proper full-scale UK British tour for goodness knows how many decades, there is demand, and altogether he's written and recorded at least 200 songs. So the opportunity to have a new compilation with a different track order is pretty huge. So every now and again, and Repertoire are a decent independent label. Every now and again, a record label comes along and goes, "Oh, let's have a Magna Carta compilation. That'll definitely sell some copies quietly," and that's what seems to happen.
Do they? I mean, I was thinking, do their records still get reviewed? I'm not sure that they do, but
they do not on things like Pitchfork or the Enemy website.
The record collectors still
really
do them?
No, not very much. No, they've sort of like dropped out of that whole scene because they haven't had a manager in Britain or even a proper agent really for such a long time. This is the amazing thing about them. They haven't really been a proper part of the music industry since the late 1970s, and yet things are still happening. And Chris is now like about to be 81 years old, so it's a phenomenal
the very age of
achievement.
Paul Simon.
Just to be having albums released is just a phenomenal achievement.
It is. So that is available on on Repertoire Records, and we look forward to the world finally catching on in bigger numbers to Magna Carta, since we've mentioned them quite often on our podcast. Now, Graham, I saw close up for the first time. I say close up. I saw in the flesh for the first time an iconic piece of material on stage at the Grand Opera House. It's a long coat being worn by a long-faced, long-bodied man.
Oh, yes.
What would it be?
I was going to say Joseph and his
Well, strange enough, I did see that. I did actually see that very show last week, but no, it wasn't that. So it was
the only person I can
Richard
think
E.
of
Grant's stage entrance. It was Richard E. Grant's stage entrance.
Really?
And he was wearing his with nail and eye coat, still fitting him beautifully. He's still a very trim 6'2" with the blue eyes. Celestine saw him close up before the show and said how handsome he still looks. And Richard was in New York on the book tour that's accompanying the release of his book, A Pocketful of Happiness. His earlier book was called With Nails, wasn't it? Which was the earlier autobiographical piece. This is rooted in the story, the very sad loss of his wife, Joan Washington. And Joan's last wish to him was that Richard should look to find a pocket full of happiness in every single day, every single remaining day. And his pocket full of happiness on the day that he was at the Grand Opera House on that stage was that it had been a quite beautiful day in North Yorkshire, which I think is a lovely pocket full of happiness on any occasion. So Richard's show was an evening with Richard E. Grant, and he was wearing, well, it was a Union flag waistcoat, which I thought was an interesting choice of attire. Yeah. He was also wearing 2 watches, one on each arm. One was given to him by Joan, and one was given to him by his father. Richard was brought up in Swaziland, and I'll go on to talk about the content of the show. And he lost this watch at one point, and in the meantime, Joan had given him a watch. And then he refound. Can you refind? I suppose you can. He found the watch that his father gave him. Rediscovered. That's the word we're looking for. So on one arm he has London time, and on the other arm he has Swaziland time. So he always knows. Really? Yeah, he always knows what time it would be.
Wow, that's a bit weird.
Well, I mean, I don't wear any watch at all, but I guess it's the most balanced thing to do to wear the 2. And obviously, Swaziland does feed into his story and into his life being
he made that film Wawa, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
He made the film Wawa as well, directed
Absolutely.
and
writing. Yeah, his father was the minister for, I think, education, if I got it right, in Swaziland. Swaziland, the smallest southern state of all. I don't mean in America. I mean just in the southern hemisphere, the smallest of all. Yeah. And his nickname is actually Swaz, so it's always been there with him. And the way that he put the story together was...
That's a very strange thing to do.
Yeah.
You can't be in 2 places at one time or in 2 time zones at one time.
You can't, but nevertheless, his nickname is Swaz, and so it's always there with him. And the way he constructed the show was to look at childhood in Swaziland and how he got into the acting world. He began with the with nail coat on and a quote from from, I'm going to get the name wrong now.
Bruce Robinson.
Bruce, not Peter, thank you. Yeah. Bruce Robinson's script he opened with, and then constructed the story of his childhood, then of his getting into the acting world, and then the crucial third element was charting, as he has kept a diary for many years, the diary passages about the passing of his wife Joan, and which was, and I knew it would be emotional no matter how many times he performs it. So he reads the passage where she takes her last breath, and at that point you could see Richard was, upset in that moment. And the way that he handled that was to quietly leave the stage, and then instead of him being on stage, up came on the screen behind him, which had provided images of him and images of roles that he'd played,
which he's played a lot, actually. So
it's a remarkably full career.
Yeah, it's bigger than you think.
Absolutely. So he, at this point, suddenly up on screen is a film recording of Nigel Slater and Richard watching Joan in her kitchen, they're obviously elsewhere, as she cooks his regular breakfast, which is a sloppy version of porridge involving no dairy. He won't eat dairy. It's a watery version of porridge in which she she had to put fruit into it, sort of chunks of pineapple or whatever, and cranberry juice and orange juice. And to this day, that is always what he has.
Fed better in prison. You get fed better in prison.
It did look like prison gruel. When he was doing the Newcastle gig, I think the night before York, he'd stayed at Jimmy Nail's house, and Jimmy Nail's partner.
So he stayed with Nail.
He stayed with Nail. Graham, excellent. That's way too quick. No, that's very good. He didn't think of that one on the night, but that's a really good night.
Yeah.
Anyway, so at the Nail HQ, this usual breakfast was made for him. He is a very charming man in every way.
That's what I love about him. He represents to me the best of being an English, classy gentleman.
Absolutely,
with a sense of humor, though, and a little bit of cheekiness.
A lot of cheekiness, quite a lot of profanities in the language. Wasn't frightened to be doing that.
Really?
The self-deprecating as well. I think the favorite series of stories that he told was his obsession with Barbra Streisand, which started. Yes. Yeah, it started when he came over on a family visit to London, and he saw Barbra. This is as a child, as a boy, about 11, I think he was, and he saw Funny Girl at the cinema, and that was it. From that moment on, Barbra Streisand. The following night, he went to see Hair, and as he put it, in years later, he realised that he'd seen Elaine Page's front bottom in that moment in Hair when the entire cast is naked for about 10 seconds. Yeah. And he told this story about his obsession with Barbra Streisand, which when he got nominated for the Oscar for Can You Forgive Me, he finally got the opportunities to see and meet Barbra. And not just once. Oh, she was absolutely. He'd written to her as a child when he read that she was going through a bad time temporarily, and he wrote to her. This was when he was 14. He wrote this letter, saying how much he liked her work and just feeling sorry for the fact that she wasn't very happy at this time, or whatever. And she rediscovered this year. She rediscovered this letter years later. Once
and put a restraining order on him.
And well, instead she wrote this very nice email response saying, "I've read your letter after all these years. I had delightful." And so they finally met, and they didn't meet just once; it was several times. And to the extent, at the end, she said, "Are you stalking me?" So, which clearly he wasn't. But
there you go.
But he was at this event where her brooch came loose. And he went, as he's showing how he did this, he went down on one knee on the Grand Opera House stage, and then said he spent the next 8 minutes or whatever fumbling, trying to readjust this brooch on Barbra, just so that obviously he can, not overindulge himself in what he was doing, but he found the opportunity to, place this brooch with a lot of care. So he could never have got closer to Barbra than that,
Well, yeah, I could see why, she'd think he was a stalker after that sort of performance. but do you think if he'd actually won the Oscar, she would have seen him again?
Good question. I mean, he went to the after show after he went to the number one Oscars party afterwards where he met her. So I think there's something so charming about him that however he handled it with her, she would be fine with him, And the way the show was also constructed, the second half, and I like the way a lot of these shows, you tend to have someone asking the star name the questions in the second half, which have been collected on his behalf, and it's someone then asking the questions. Richard did it in a way that I rather liked, which was that QR code came up on the screen. You could send a question to the QR code, and then Richard himself would sort of fill it through which ones he wanted to answer. So he didn't have an intermediary in the way, as it were.
No.
It was Richard speaking directly and answering questions directly to members of the audience, which I think is a better way of doing it. I know that's putting myself out of
but it also means he's in control.
Say again, Graham?
That means he's in control because he gets to pick the questions. Whereas if you just put your hand up and get given the mic, he doesn't know what you're going to say. This means he does know.
That's true, but increasingly they don't tend to let that happen. I mean, I think that's the best way to do it of all, so that a question can be sprung by surprise. But more often than not now, there's an intermediary that's deciding it. I take your point that maybe he then chooses not to answer a certain question or whatever. But we never know because he doesn't evade it. He
But
struck me as being very candid. I thought he handled the
do
questions
you
very
think
well.
do you think Richard E. Grant's sort of last in the line of great raconteurs, like from Hollywood, a bit like Peter Ustinov and Orson Welles in the 60s and 70s, how they could just talk about their experiences in a charming and funny, intelligent way, and you just like listening to them? Isn't it like a throwback to those days, the glory days
He
of
is.
filmmaking?
I mean, Rupert Everett's books from his acting experiences are seen probably as being the best of the memoirs of more recent times. But that's an interesting thought. That how does Richard E. Grant compare with that? I mean, I guess you're looking back to the days of a David Niven writing his kind of memoirs.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think yes. I mean, I there is something old-fashioned about him anyway as a star. I think he links the past great eras of acting. There's something about him that has star about him, whether he's on a screen or not. And he is a raconteur.
He has a twinkle in his eye, doesn't he?
And he is a very, very natural raconteur, and was joyful company to be with. I think the fact that he's fronting up and even going around and talking about death, talking about grief, about loss, about love, I think this is the perfect show for him to do.
That is sort of on trend though, because everybody these days opens up about their deepest emotional moments, no matter how tragic or painful they are. That is just what everybody does. Whereas Ustinov and Orson Welles didn't. They were just charming and a bit bitchy.
Yes, and obviously Rupert Everett's books far bitchier in tone. Maybe it's a good point, Gran, because actually, if you look, what have we had recent documentaries on the mental state of Lewis Capaldi and the mental state of Ed Sheeran, and in the case of Richard E. Grant, I think it's interesting to go out and talk as he does about the impact of grief on him, but also he turns it into love and a celebration of a long marriage. And what that has meant to him. And he again would say, he says it's that old one of believing never ever go to sleep on an argument. But he took that point further. He said, right, in that situation, you go really close up, and you tell someone to their face, I love you. And if they don't want to hear it at that moment, you just keep saying it. I love you, close up. And that he said he never ever stopped talking, never ever stopped sharing the same bed ever with Joan. From the moment they met, that's how it was. And I think that was a beautiful way for him to make that point about love. And it's a beautiful way, Graham, if I may say so, for us to finish this week's podcast.
You've been listening to the podcast Two Big Egos in a Small Car. Your hosts were Graham Chalmers and Charles Hutchinson. This was a Baltic sub-production.